Hey everybody, we're moving on to our final unit of AMP1. This is going to start our conversation about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We've been focusing a lot on how neurons work and basic nerve transmission, but what about the larger picture? How does the brain work? How does the spinal cord work? What do all the peripheral nerves do? That's what we'll begin to focus on in this video and going forward. Just a quick reminder of the basic organization, and I know you've seen this already, but the central nervous system, the CNS, consists of the brain and spinal cord. And the CNS in general is to be an integrating center, to make sense of the information that's traveling to and from it. The peripheral nervous system, the PNS, is really the system that gathers information and sends it to the CNS, or carries information away to muscles and glands and organs and to make something happen. So recall, peripheral nervous system has a sensory and a motor pathway. Motor can be voluntary or involuntary, and then the involuntary consists of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, and we'll delve into that organization a little bit later. But what we're going to focus on initially here is we're going to focus on the CNS. In particular, we're going to start with the spinal cord first and then work our way to the brain. So the spinal cord, as you can see here, is not, most people seem to think this, it does not run from your brain all the way to the end to your tailbone. It does not do that. In fact, it stops right here. This stops at about L1 to L2. For most people, the spinal cord is about 18 inches long, and it's about the width of your pinky. And you see there are two regions of enlargement, though, the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. And there's a little bit of a hint as to why they're occurring there, why they would be larger there, and if it's not clear why they would need to be larger, think about what's extending this way, and obviously this way and this way, arms and legs. So the cervical enlargement is going to contain extra tissue, if you will, for processing arm signals, and we'll get to more detail a little bit later. And the lumbar enlargement region is going to be where, again, you're going to have extra nerve information passing through it, so it's going to be slightly larger. So the spinal cord is going to have 31 regions, if you will, and the regions are designated by the spinal nerves, and you see one of them sticking out right here, and we'll talk about where they come from in a second. Recall, of course, the spinal cord passes through the vertebral foramen of the vertebrae. So let's look at a little more detail at what you can see in this transverse section of the spinal cord and vertebrae, and talk about some of the things that you want to focus on. So first, notice this is the spinal cord here, okay, and you can see a faint gray butterfly in there, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Just point out again the bone that you see here of the vertebrae, and I also want to point out this yellow in here. This is part of the epidural space, and the yellow, which looks kind of fatty, is fat to help cushion the spinal cord inside the vertebral foramen. We also have some features to point out to you. Notice how we have, coming out of the spinal cord, we have this line, which is the dorsal root. It is a branch of, it is part of the spinal nerve. The other part of that is the ventral root, which is coming here. So these two together are going to fuse and make up a spinal nerve. A spinal nerve therefore carries information as both afferent and efferent. The afferent part, the carrying information to the central nervous system, is going to be through the dorsal part, and the efferent part, carrying information from the CNS, from the spinal cord, out to the muscles and the glands, is going to be through the ventral part, or the ventral root. So again, notice its organization here, and there's several layers. You see motor in several places here, and we'll talk about those in a second. Those are going to be some of the connective tissues that help support and nourish the spinal cord. One more thing while we're here is the denticulate ligament. You see a very faint blue ligament here and on this side. there are going to be these ligaments that hold, there's 21 of them, that hold the spinal cord in place all along its length, so the spinal cord does not shift around laterally within the vertebral foramen. Okay, if you look at this view of the spinal cord, it may look slightly different. We're not seeing the skeletal component, of course, we're not seeing the vertebrae, and we're not seeing all the membranes. And again, it looks a little different because we have some coloration here, but I'll explain that in a second. But this transverse section, you can see really well the gray matter, the gray butterfly that's in the middle of the spinal cord. And we'll talk about that more in class, but that's going to be primarily involved in our reflex actions of the spinal cord. The other major function, and I'm looking down here now, of the spinal cord is to propagate nerve impulses. It's to be the highway both to and from the brain. And what you see here in the coloration is looking at these what are called columns. The red columns you see here are descending tracts. That is, these are going to be going from the brain through the spinal cord out to the muscles and the glands and the other tissues. So these are going to be they're called descending tracts. These are going to be, again, your motor signals are traveling through these. The blue represents the sensory or the afferent signals. These are going to be the ascending tracts that are sending information up the spinal cord to the brain. Now again, when you look at the spinal cord in reality, you're seeing this. You're not seeing these individual columns or tracts at all. But I just want to point out that within all of this white tissue here, all this myelinated tissue, you have these tracts. Some of them are traveling anteriorly and some of them are traveling posteriorly, depending upon if they are motor, which are the descending tracts, or if they are sensory, which are the ascending tracts. In the middle of the spinal cord, you do see this. You see a hole here. This is the central canal, and through the central canal is going to be passing cerebrospinal fluid, which helps to nourish the spinal cord, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. I also want to point out while we're here, once again, the dorsal root and the ventral root. And again, how can you tell the difference? The dorsal root has this ganglia, which is this enlarged region here. That's actually going to have a collection of neuron cell bodies, and it's fatter. So if you ever look at a spinal cord or drawing like this and trying to figure out which one is which is anterior, which is posterior, trying to get yourself oriented, look for the fat. The fat part here, the fatter root is going to be the dorsal root. And again, what's going to come out of this in both directions is going to be the peripheral nerve. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Again, they're peripheral, they're not part of the CNS, but they connect to the CNS at this place. Okay, let me move on here, and let me clean this up. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about the idea of dermatomes and myotomes. We say these peripheral nerves extend out from the spinal cord, and they're going to the muscles, and they're going to the skin, and they're also coming from the muscles and from the skin. We refer to a skin area that's served by a single nerve root as a dermatome. So if this was, let's pretend for a second that we're talking about this one, if this were to be one that we're focusing on here, it's going to go and serve a single area where that part of the skin is going to send its signals through that spinal nerve back to the spinal cord. That is a dermatome. I'll talk about this more in a moment, but myotomes are going to be groups of muscles that are controlled by a single spinal nerve root, and we'll get to why those are significant in just a moment. There are some variations, even though most people are going to have pretty similar dermatomes and myotomes, and in fact, we can map these. Oops. So you see here, this is a dermatome map. So when you see, for example, T2 or L3, this refers to a particular spinal nerve root that's coming off, and that actually all of the skin sensory information is going to travel via the spinal nerve root L3 and then go to the brain. So there's 8 cervical roots, C1 through C8. C1 doesn't actually have a dermatome, but C2 through C8 does. And you see, for example, here is C2, here is C3. We also are going to have the thoracic ones, and we're going to have the sacral ones. So you'll see T1 through T12, you'll see S1 through S5. You will see those, what you're seeing here is what appears to be V1, V2, and V3 is actually referring to a cranial nerve that we'll talk about more a little bit later. So what's the significance of these? If a particular dermatome is affected by either, say, a rash or by pain, it could indicate a particular dorsal root ganglion is infected. For example, when we see something like this, we see this pattern of the rash here. We see the pattern of the rash here. And in fact, we can go back and diagnose which dermatome is likely infected, in this case, by shingles. If you have herpes, the herpes virus causes chickenpox and causes shingles. So the virus is hiding out actually in the dorsal root ganglion, and every so often it flares up and causes this reaction. So if you go back for a second, you can probably figure out that we're talking about either T4 or T5 is responsible for causing that rash. So that's where that person is going to be infected. Again, myotomes just indicate muscle groups. And once again, why this is significant when we're talking about mapping out myotomes. Let's say somebody has particular muscle weakness in a group of muscles. That particular group of muscles, because those are all weak, suggests that the spinal nerve root that's feeding that or responsible for that might be infected, or it could even be a herniated disc at that location. So clinically, dermatomes and myotomes are very valuable in helping us figure out what's going on with those nerve roots from the spinal cord. Finally, I want to talk about the space. Sorry, let me get out of the way here. I want to discuss these membranes that actually surround the spinal cord. These are the spinal meninges, and I'm sure you've heard of these. These meninges are going to be these connective tissue membranes that surround the spinal cord to help nourish it and help protect it. What you don't see in this picture, and it's kind of out here in this space, this is going to be the epidural space. Remember, that's going to be all around the spinal cord. And let me switch colors for 1 second. And then out here would be the vertebrae, the inside of the vertebrae. So I'm going to take those off for a second. But we'd have the vertebrae, then we're going to have this epidural space. And if that sounds familiar, yes, that is where the medication for an epidural is going to be administered, into that space between the vertebrae and the spinal cord. And then we're going to get to the meninges. So when we look at the meninges, the first one is the dura mater. And if you look at it here, even in this picture, it looks kind of thick. It's a rather thick connective tissue that surrounds and protects the spinal cord. The dura mater actually means tough mother. That gives you an idea. It's a pretty tough tissue. So that's going to be the outermost meninge. Underneath that, or deep to that, is going to be the subdural space. The subdural space is going to contain a serous fluid, just a little bit of a lubricating fluid between that, between the dura mater and the next meninge. The next one is the arachnoid mater. And the arachnoid mater, the arachnoid means spidery, and you can see there it has sort of a wispy, kind of a spider web appearance to it. So that is the next meninge. So dura mater, the subdural space, the arachnoid mater. Below that, or deep to that, is the subarachnoid space. Sub means below. And in that, we're going to find the important cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid, of course, remember, is formed by the ependymal cells of the neuroglial cells of the brain. That fluid is going to be passing through the central canal and also through the subarachnoid space and helping to nourish and helping to protect the spinal cord. Deep to that is our last meninge, and that is the pia mater. Pia means delicate mother. It's a really wispy tissue that's directly on, and you can see it here better, directly on the spinal cord. Blood vessels are traveling through it. It's a very, very delicate tissue, and it's attached directly to the spinal cord. So let's go through it one more time. If we go from the vertebrae itself, the next thing in is the epidural space, then the dura mater, the subdural space, the arachnoid mater, the subarachnoid space, and the pia mater. Those are all the layers of the meninges. And of course, why is that significant, and why are the meninges important? Well, they are providing protection, and if we get bacterial or viral pathogens affecting the meninges, this can disrupt the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid, and it can eventually kill the neurons that we associate with the spinal cord. So meningitis is a pretty serious condition. That does it for this video. Thank you very much.